It was a humid Tuesday evening in front of St. Jude's Hospital. The revolving doors spun endlessly as people hurried home. Suddenly, the rhythm broke. A man in his late 30s began to scream, his hands clawing at the air, his eyes wide with a terrifying, drug-induced panic. The crowd scattered, fear rippling through the sidewalk. A nearby police officer reached for his radio, moving in with caution. But before he could act, a tired nurse in wrinkled scrubs stepped into the center of the storm. She didn't shout, she didn't run, and in exactly 45 seconds, she changed a life forever. The power of quiet strength. Elena Ward was 31 years old, and at this exact moment, she felt every single day of it. Her feet were throbbing inside her worn-out sneakers, a dull ache that pulsed with every step. She had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift in the psychiatric emergency wing, a place where the air was always heavy with the metallic tang of hospital-grade cleaner and the unspoken weight of broken stories. It was a world where time was measured in medication doses and crisis interventions. Her light blue scrubs were wrinkled, stained with coffee from a quick break she barely remembered taking. Her hair was pulled back in a messy, functional bun that was starting to come loose, and her eyes were underlined by the dark, stubborn shadows of deep exhaustion. To anyone passing her on the busy street outside, Elena was effectively invisible. In the grand hierarchy of the city, she was just another anonymous medical worker heading home to a cold dinner and a few hours of dreamless sleep. People didn't see the woman who had spent her afternoon talking a veteran down from a ledge, or holding the hand of a mother whose brain had become a labyrinth of shadows. They just saw a tired woman in scrubs, a nobody. The hospital entrance was a chaotic crossroads of human existence. It was a stage where the most vulnerable moments of life played out daily. Patients arriving with hope, families leaving with grief, and the constant, indifferent hum of the city breathing around them like a giant machine. The heavy, stagnant air felt thick with the exhaust of passing buses and the faint scent of rain that refused to fall. As Elena stepped onto the concrete sidewalk, clutching her bag to her side, the atmosphere shifted with a violent suddenness. The background noise of traffic and distant sirens was pierced by a sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. A man, let's call him Elias, was standing near a large stone planter, but he wasn't really there. His body was physically present, but his mind had retreated to a dark, jagged place. He was caught in the middle of a profound behavioral breakdown, likely triggered by a mixture of environmental overstimulation and a chemical imbalance that had reached a boiling point. He was shouting at shadows that only he could see, his movements jerky, uncoordinated, and terrifyingly unpredictable. "Stay back! You're all watching me! I see the lights! They're coming through the walls!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a raw, primal fear that echoed off the glass towers of the hospital. The reaction from the public was instantaneous and predictable, a perfect demonstration of the bystander effect. People didn't try to help. They recoiled in a wave of collective discomfort. They stepped into the street, avoiding eye contact, their faces a mask of judgment mixed with a selfish kind of relief that it wasn't their problem. In a crowded city, a person losing control is often treated like an invisible fire. Everyone sees the smoke, but no one wants to get close enough to be burned. A police officer, Officer Miller, who had been patrolling the nearby intersection, noticed the commotion immediately. He began to approach, his heavy boots sounding a rhythmic warning on the pavement. His hand rested instinctively near his duty belt, hovering close to his taser. Miller wasn't an aggressive man by nature, but he was a man trained in the doctrine of command presence. He had been taught to control a situation through a show of authority and physical dominance. He saw a disturbed individual who represented a threat to public order, a problem that needed to be restrained and removed. But Elena, watching from the curb, saw something entirely different. She didn't see a threat. She didn't see a criminal or a nuisance. She saw a patient who was drowning in his own adrenaline. She had spent the last 12 hours dealing with exactly this. Men and women whose neurochemistry had betrayed them, leaving them terrified, isolated, and alone in a world that only saw their noise and not their pain. She knew that Elias was experiencing a sensory overload. To him, the flickering streetlights were blinding suns, and the murmur of the crowd was a roaring thunderstorm. She stood perfectly still for a moment, her nursing instincts overriding her immense physical fatigue. She watched Miller approach from the left, his posture rigid and challenging. She watched the crowd gathering at what they thought was a safe distance, their phones raised to record a tragedy for social media. She knew with absolute certainty that if the police moved in too fast or spoke with too much authority, it would trigger Elias's fight-or-flight response. And in his state, he would fight. It would end in a violent struggle on the hard concrete, injuries to the officer, and a traumatized man being hauled away in chains. She didn't wait for a supervisor's nod. She didn't ask for permission from the uniform. She simply stepped off the curb and began to walk toward the white-hot center of the storm. She was the only person moving toward the man while the rest of the world was running away. She looked like just a tired nurse. But in reality, she was the most tactically prepared person in a 3-block radius, carrying a weapon that Officer Miller didn't even know existed. Empathy. If you think ordinary people can make extraordinary differences, comment, "That is unfair." The tension in the air was a physical weight, like the pressure before a massive thunderstorm. Elias was now pacing in a tight, frantic circle, his boots scuffing the stone planter. His breathing was audible from 10 feet away, shallow, rapid, and gasping, the sound of a lung trying to find air in a vacuum. He was redlining, a physiological state where the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logic, shuts down, handing the controls over to the amygdala. Every movement from the crowd, every flash of a camera phone, every heavy rhythmic footstep from the approaching officer was a spark hitting a pile of dry tinder. Officer Miller was calling out commands, his voice booming with an authority that he thought would bring order. "Sir, I need you to calm down right now. Show me your hands. Step away from the planter and sit down." It was exactly the wrong approach for a mind in crisis. To Elias, those loud commands didn't sound like help. They sounded like the barking of a predator. He snarled, a sound more animal than human, his body tensing into a knot of muscle. His hands balled into white-knuckled fists. "Get away! Don't touch me! You're with them! I won't let you take my thoughts!" Elena stopped exactly 8 feet away from him. She didn't look at Officer Miller, who was now signaling for backup into his shoulder-mounted radio. Instead, she was performing a high-speed clinical assessment that no academy could teach. It was an assessment born of thousands of hours in the pit of the psych ward. She analyzed the man's pupils. They were dilated to the point where the iris was a thin sliver, suggestive of either extreme sympathetic nervous system activation or a stimulant-induced psychosis. She looked at his hands. They were empty, no immediate weapon, but they were shaking with a fine, rapid tremor. She noted the space around them. There was an alleyway to the right that could be an escape route for him, but also a trap for the police. She knew the physics of a mental breakdown. If she moved too fast, he would bolt into traffic. If she spoke too loudly, he would scream until his lungs gave out. She needed to become the lighthouse. In nursing school, she had learned about the aura of calm. A lighthouse doesn't run toward a sinking ship through the waves. It stays stationary. It stays bright. It remains a fixed, unshakable point in the middle of the gale. Elena stood her ground, widening her stance slightly for stability, but keeping her shoulders relaxed and her hands visible. She didn't use officer talk. She didn't use authority. She used caregiver energy, a frequency that bypasses the fear centers of the brain and speaks directly to the soul. In the background, a young soldier, an off-duty sergeant on leave named Marcus, was watching from the bus stop bench. Marcus was a man trained in CQC and tactical movements, a man who had seen combat in environments where the rules were written in blood. He was already mentally calculating the distance, planning how he would tackle Elias if the man lunged at the nurse. He saw Elena step in, and his first instinct was one of protective anger. She's going to get hurt. She's an amateur in a professional's fight. She's in the way. But Marcus, as he watched her, started to see something he hadn't expected. He saw her feet. They weren't trembling. He saw her breathing. It was deep and rhythmic, like a sniper prepping for a long-distance shot. He noticed the way she positioned herself, just off-center, avoiding a direct confrontational line of sight. but never yielding space. He realized that she wasn't in the way. She was the only one who actually had a plan that required more courage than any tactical charge he had ever witnessed. Elena saw the police officer get within 5 feet, his hand tightening on the grip of his taser. The situation was seconds away from an escalation that couldn't be undone. Elena raised her left hand, not toward Elias but toward the officer, a small, firm, and incredibly commanding stop signal. It was a gesture so full of professional authority that Miller actually paused, his brow furrowed in confusion. Elena then turned her focus entirely back to the man in the center. She began to synchronize her own breathing with his. Then slowly, deliberately, she began to slow her own pace. Humans have a natural biological reflex called mirroring or limbic resonance. In moments of extreme stress, we subconsciously match the emotional and physiological energy of the person closest to us who appears to be in control. If the police brought aggression, Elias would mirror that aggression until the room exploded. If Elena brought a profound, unshakable, and almost holy calm, he might just mirror peace. She looked at the digital clock on the hospital's brick wall. 1844. The 45-second window was about to begin. The crowd went silent, sensing the shift in the air. The officer stood frozen, caught between his training and this nurse's confidence. The soldier Marcus narrowed his eyes, leaning forward on the bench, and Elena Ward finally opened her mouth to speak. If you realize acting too soon can make things worse, comment, I was wrong. 0 to 10 seconds. The soft entry. Elena didn't bark a command. She didn't use a voice of God to demand compliance. She whispered, "Hey, look at me." The voice was low, melodic, and completely devoid of judgment or fear. It was the specific frequency of a mother talking to a scared child who had just had a nightmare. Elias stopped screaming for a split second, the sound dying in his throat like a guttering candle. The sudden change in the acoustic environment, from the barking of police to the soft hum of this woman, caught his hyper-vigilant brain by surprise. He turned his head slowly, his eyes darting frantically across the sidewalk, until they finally landed on the woman in blue scrubs. Elena didn't stare him down like a target. She kept her gaze soft, looking toward his eyes but not piercing them, which could be perceived as a challenge. "I'm right here. You're safe. Nobody's going to touch you. I promise." 10 to 25 seconds. The connection. Elias let out a ragged sob, his body still vibrating with the aftershocks of his panic. They're all watching. The lights. They're too loud. They're burning me." "I know," Elena replied, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "I'm a nurse. I work right there in that building. I see this every day. It's just the hospital lights, Elias. They're bright, but they can't hurt you. In a minute, we're going to walk into a quiet room where the lights are dim. Just focus on my voice. Can you do that? Just my voice. Everything else is just noise." She was creating what psych nurses call a sensory tunnel. She was systematically shutting out the sirens, the hum of the crowd, and the visual threat of the police. She was making herself the only stable thing in his universe. As she spoke, she watched the tension leave his jaw, a tiny micro-movement that signaled a neurological shift from survival to connection. Marcus, the soldier watching from the bench, noticed her hands. They weren't near her belt. They weren't clenched. They were open, palms slightly up. A universal ancient sign of peace and nothing to hide. He realized she was using a high-level psychological technique used in advanced hostage negotiation, but she was doing it with the effortless casualness of someone making a cup of tea for a friend. He felt a chill go down his spine. She's not a nurse. She's an operator. 25 to 35 seconds, the perimeter control. While keeping her eyes locked in that soft connection with Elias, Elena caught Officer Miller's gaze. Without breaking her vocal rhythm or her focus on the patient, she made a small, downward pushing motion with her left hand. "Back off. Lower the energy. Now." Officer Miller, who had seen hundreds of street confrontations, saw the man's shoulders finally drop an inch. He saw the fists unclench. He understood the shift in the power dynamic. He took 2 deliberate steps back. He lowered his radio. He signaled his partner to stay in the car. The aggressive authority bubble around Elias began to deflate. Elena was managing the entire environment with micro gestures in a steady tone. "Deep breath for me, Elias," she said, her voice a soothing balm. "In for 4. Hold it. Out for 4. You're doing so good. You're doing exactly what you need to do." 35 to 45 seconds. The transition. The man's hands stopped clawing at the air. They fell limp to his sides. His breathing slowed from a frantic pant to a heavy, weary rhythm. The red zone of combat readiness was fading into a yellow zone of recovery. He wasn't cured, he wasn't fine, but he was no longer a bomb ready to detonate. "There we go," Elena whispered, stepping 1 inch closer, testing the boundary. He didn't flinch. "The officer behind me, his name is Miller. He's here to make sure we can get across the street safely. We're going to get you a glass of water in a quiet room with no bright lights. Is that okay with you, Elias?" Elias nodded, a small, weary movement that carried the weight of 1,000 years. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a profound exhaustion that mirrored Elena's own. He looked at her scrubs, seeing the nurse badge, and for the first time, he saw a human being instead of a demon. 45 seconds. In the time it takes to read a short email or tie a pair of shoes, Elena Ward had prevented a riot, stopped a potential police shooting, and saved a man from the worst, most terrifying version of himself. She stood on the sidewalk, the evening wind ruffling her loose hair as the heavy glass doors of the hospital slid shut behind Elias and the officer. The sidewalk was suddenly, eerily silent. The crowd began to disperse, but they moved differently now. They weren't avoiding a threat. They were processing a miracle they didn't quite understand. They looked at the nurse as she stood there, leaning slightly against the stone planter Elias had just occupied. The soldier, Marcus, remained at the bus stop, his eyes fixed on the tired nurse. He had seen commanders lead men into the mouth of hell, but he had never seen anyone lead a fractured soul back from the edge with so much grace and so little ego. He realized that the greatest warriors don't always carry rifles. Sometimes they just carry a stethoscope and a heart that refuses to quit. If you believe calm control is stronger than aggression, comment, "I am indebted." The aftermath was profoundly quiet. There were no sirens, no news cameras, and no medals waiting on the sidewalk. Just the cooling pavement and the hum of the city returning to its baseline of indifference. Officer Miller walked back out of the hospital entrance a few minutes later. He looked different than he had before. The command presence was gone, replaced by a humble, thoughtful expression. He looked for the nurse. He found her leaning against a lamppost a few yards away, finally letting the full weight of her exhaustion take hold of her frame. She looked small in the shadow of the massive hospital building. He walked over, his heavy boots sounding loud and clumsy compared to her silent grace. "Hey," Miller said, his voice much softer, much more human than it had been 45 seconds ago. "I didn't catch your name back there." "Elena," she said, giving him a small, weary smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That was something else, Elena," Miller said, shaking his head as he looked at his own hands. "I've been on the force for 9 years. I was about to go for my taser. I was certain he was going to lunge at the crowd. I was prepping for a fight. You turned the volume down on the whole world in under a minute." "He just needed to be heard, officer," Elena replied simply, her voice devoid of any boast. "People scream when they feel like they're invisible. When the world becomes a threat, the brain stops thinking and starts surviving. I just made sure he knew he wasn't alone in that survival." Miller nodded, a newfound respect in his eyes that went beyond professional courtesy. "Well, thank you. You probably saved me from 6 months of internal affairs reports and a lot of paperwork, but more importantly, you definitely saved that man's life. I don't think he would have survived a struggle today." Standing a few feet away, Marcus, the soldier, finally stepped forward. He had been sitting on the bench, mesmerized by the interaction. He didn't say a word at first. He simply stood at attention and gave Elena a sharp, crisp, and deeply respectful nod. The kind of nod a junior officer gives to a decorated veteran who has just saved the company. I've seen special ops negotiators try to do that in the field, Marcus said, his voice deep and serious, carrying the authority of his own experiences. Most of them fail. They fail because they can't lose their ego. They can't stop being the boss for long enough to be the bridge. You don't have an ego at all, do you, nurse? Elena chuckled, a soft, dry sound that turned into a small cough. I'm way too tired for an ego, Sergeant. I just wanted to go home and have a sandwich. You did a good thing, Marcus said, his eyes locking onto hers. A soldier's strength is often in the rifle and the tactical strike. But yours is in the silence and the connection. I've seen a lot of things in my time, but I won't forget what I saw on this sidewalk today. You fought a battle with words that I couldn't have won with a platoon. Elena picked up her bag, adjusting the strap on her aching shoulder. She didn't wait for a round of applause. She didn't wait for a thank you from the hospital board or a mention in the morning news. She didn't even check to see if anyone had recorded her. She walked toward the subway entrance, merging back into the evening flow of the city. To the people on the train, she was just a tired woman in blue scrubs with messy hair, a nobody taking up a seat. But to a police officer who didn't have to live with the memory of a shooting, and to a man named Elias who woke up in a safe, quiet bed instead of a cold jail cell. She was a legend. She had changed the world in 45 seconds, and she did it without leaving a single scar or raising her voice once. As she sat on the plastic seat of the subway car, watching the dark tunnel walls fly past, she finally closed her eyes. She wasn't thinking about being a hero. She was thinking about the patient she had to see tomorrow morning. She was just a nurse, and for Elena Ward, that was more than enough. If you believe doing the right thing doesn't need recognition, comment, I will live kindly. The story of Elena Ward is a vital reminder that real power isn't always the loudest thing in the room. In fact, the most transformative power is often the quietest. We live in a culture that worships the aggressive response. We are taught from a young age that to solve a problem, we must dominate it. We think that to control a situation, we must overwhelm it with superior force, louder voices, and more rigid authority. But in that 45-second window on a humid Tuesday evening, force would have been an absolute disaster. Force would have turned a medical crisis into a criminal tragedy. Elena proved that true strength is the ability to maintain your own internal order when everything outside of you is in total chaos. She proved that lighthouse leadership, the act of staying calm, staying visible, and staying steady, can guide even the most broken and terrified souls back to the shore of reality. It is the art of absorbing the storm without becoming part of it. We often overlook the quiet professionals in our society, the nurses, the teachers, the caregivers, the social workers, the people who work in the background of our greatest human struggles. We assume that because they aren't carrying weapons or wearing tactical armor, they aren't on the front lines. But the truth is, they are the ones who hold the very fabric of our society together when it starts to tear at the seams. They are the ones who do the heavy lifting of the heart. You don't need a uniform to be a hero. You don't need a fancy title or a badge to lead. You just need the clarity to see the humanity in the person screaming in front of you, and the courage to meet them there, in their darkest moment, without judgment. Elena didn't fix Elias's life in 45 seconds. He still had a long, difficult road of recovery ahead of him, but she gave him 45 seconds of peace. She gave him a chance to breathe when the world was choking him. She gave him a path to help that didn't involve violence or further trauma. She understood that sometimes the most effective intervention is simply the refusal to become the enemy. The next time you find yourself in a tense situation, whether it's at work, at home, or on a crowded street, remember the tired nurse. Remember that the fastest way to calm a storm isn't to shout back at the wind. It's to become the anchor that the wind can't move. Real impact doesn't happen on grand stages with spotlights and cameras. It happens in the quiet, 45-second windows that no one else notices, but where everything is at stake. Be the person who brings the light. Be the person who mirrors peace instead of mirroring anger. Be the lighthouse. Because in a world full of noise, aggression, and misunderstanding, the most powerful thing you can ever be is a calm, steady voice in the dark. If you believe the ability to stay calm and guide a situation is real strength, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that sometimes the fastest actions are the quietest ones, don't forget to subscribe for more.